Okay, well, welcome anybody who's watching. My name is Dean Case. I'm with SAE SoCal, and we are doing our first ever SAE SoCal webinar. Uh, we started out last year, the section year, with 5 amazing events that were all live. We had a meeting at SEMA headquarters with Ed Iskandarian and John Warniak. So we had both the past, present, and future of SEMA. We had a great meeting with SHIP over at the Honda Racing Museum, or not the Honda Racing Museum, but the overall American Honda Museum that had some cool race vehicles. We had a presentation on Faraday Future over at the Automobile Driving Museum in El Segundo. We had a presentation on Robo Race at their headquarters in Marina del Rey, and we had our annual student workshop because SAE SoCal is home to a wide variety of universities. We have over a dozen schools building cars for Formula SAE in Baja. But obviously COVID hit, knocked out a few of our events we had planned around the Acura Grand Prix of Long Beach. And so it took us a little while. We're all volunteers. So everyone behind the scenes on this, and a huge shout out to John Steiner and TJ Keon for making this work. We're going to try another one next week, and hopefully we'll have at least 1 or 2 of these a month going forward. So really this welcome is on behalf of Mike Moyer, Mike Guidry, and the entire SAE SoCal volunteer board. And like I said, I want to stress that word volunteer. This doesn't happen with paid staff. We're all here just because we appreciate what SAE has done for the industry, what it's done for our personal careers, what it does for the future of education. So without any further ado, I want to kind of get into the heart of the subject here. We kind of combined 2 speakers because it turned out they knew one another. Chris Willis was an engineer on the amazing Electromotive / NPTI Porsche crushing Nissan GTP team back in the late 80s, early 90s. And he told a tale of the development of that championship winning car from an insider's perspective. Great book. Jonathan Ingram is a motorsports journalist who's been covering the sport for quite a few years and has written a number of books. He's Atlanta based, so this COVID thing actually a little bit of an upside is it kind of spurred us to help bring in speakers from outside of our own section. So we've got Jonathan Ingram dialing in from Atlanta. We may or may not be able to see his smiling face on the screen. We're having a couple of little technical glitches with our first Zoom run here, but Jonathan wrote a book on the HANS device. If you're not familiar with that, you should. The HANS device, which is head and neck support, was one of the greatest life-saving advances in all of motorsports. Just some amazing technology. It was developed by, and Jonathan will tell the story, an engineer and a doctor who happen to be related. But it's a really interesting tale. And for any of the students, I would highly recommend both books. There's some great tales of what it took to develop a championship-winning product, championship-winning race car, and a life-saving product. So without any further ado, why don't we bring up Chris Willis? If you turn on his microphone and his video, so you can see Chris's smiling face. And then, Chris, if you want to go ahead and screen. But Chris, I won't give you his complete bio because it's online, but he kind of landed, I have to say, kind of the dream job right out of school into an, at that time, up-and-coming team, because when he joined the Nissan team, they were not championship contenders. That was still a couple of years away, and that's what Chris is going to talk about. So, Chris, take it away.
Okay. All right. So, start the presentation. Hold on 1 second. Okay, here we go. Hi, my name's Chris Willis. I wrote Developing a Champion, the Electromotive Nissan GTP story. I've been a fan of auto racing since my dad took me to an SCCA race when I was just 4 years old. I've been a fan of auto racing the whole time. In 1985, I graduated from North Carolina State University with a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. After graduating, Wes, who was a family friend, offered me a job in the design office of Electromotive Engineering in January of 1986. The book begins with the history of electromotive racing, starting when Don Devendorf and John Knepp met in 1974. Don was an electronics genius and a rocket scientist for Hughes Aircraft in the mid-1960s during the beginning of the electronics revolution. John was an experienced mechanic who had worked for Pete Brock's BRE race team. Don and John pioneered a crank-fired electronic ignition system in a Datsun B210, which was unheard of in the 70s and 80s, and won the 1977 IMSA RS Championship. The system included an electronic advance and a rev limiter. In the book, I explain why and how this system was developed. The crank-fired system was then converted to the normally aspirated Nissan 280ZX engine and carried Don to the 1979 IMSA GTU Championship. Wes Moss joined them in late 1981 and added his mechanical engineering expertise to the team. He had worked at Holman Moody and was involved in the Ford GT development in the mid-1960s. He helped design and build the 1982 Electromotive Championship-winning GTO car, and later partnered with Don and John to form Electromotive Engineering Incorporated in 1984 to perform special engineering projects for Nissan and race the GTP cars. In the first chapter, I recall their early successes and their engineering approach to racing. I also identify the key people who came together to make the eventual GTP success happen. Expanding on what he had done with the B210, Don created an electronic engine control processor in 1981 to control the turbocharged Nissan GTP engine. After watching, to control the turbocharged GTO engine. After watching the Porsche 935 GTX cars struggling to control their combustion process, resulting in blown up turbos and engines, Don thought this was a perfect fit for electronics. The electronic engine control unit was before its time, controlling the ignition, fuel delivery, and boost of the 2.8-liter engine. Formula One wasn't even using electronics until 1983, when Bosch Motortronic system debuted without boost control. I explained Don's approach, his design and mapping of the first electromotive unit, which was all analog using function generators. In late 1984, Nissan in Japan contracted Electromotive Engineering to produce a digital version of the EECP to control the new Nissan V6 engine. I go over the electronic design concepts they used, the struggles with radio frequency interference, the solutions to control it, and the continued development that made the EECP a state-of-the-art engine control unit during its time. Also in 1984, Electromotive Incorporated was contracted by Nissan in Japan to design and build the V6 engines for the Group C series. The Nissan would be adapted to the Electromotive program also and could produce over 1,000 horsepower. I go into depth on each part of the engine design to convert the original stock iron block engine into a high horsepower turbo race engine. In late 1985, Nissan in Japan contracted Electromotive Engineering to design and manufacture an aluminum block version of the stock iron block for the Japanese Group C program, and eventually the GTP program. This was the first project I was involved in. With Wes's direction, I was responsible for the detailed drawings of the book and all the related components, which were produced by hand on a drawing board. In the book, I detail the design and developments of the aluminum block, including strain gauge testing and improvements we made to the shortcomings of the iron block. Electromotive realized early on that a wind tunnel was needed to understand the complex aerodynamics of a GTP car. So in 1983, they designed and built a 1/7 scale moving ground plane wind tunnel. I go over the reasons why they would not settle for a stationary ground plane. I also describe in detail the build and the unbelievable accuracy of the wind tunnel, especially considering its size. I also cover the aerodynamic advancements Yoshi made, including wind tunnel results, and the iconic winning shape he created that dominated the IMSA GTP series of the late 1980s and early 1990s. However, it was a long journey to get to the winning ways of 1988. The first Nissan GTP was built by Lola Cars in England. Lola had just produced the Corvette GTP T710 for Rick Hendrick. The Nissan T810 was based on this design with input from Electromotive on the cooling airflow through the car. The aerodynamics under the car were a disaster though. I lay out the problems Electromotive had with the new car and the lessons learned to better understand how to build a successful GTP car. After struggling with reliability problems, Kaz Kasner, who was head of the Nissan Motorsports North America, hired Trevor Harris to design a new chassis and new front suspension. The chassis, combined with the new aluminum block, improved electronic controls, ever-improving aerodynamics, and Goodyear tires made this car unbeatable for a record 8 straight Camel GT wins in 1988. I go over each of these developments to explain the approach and designs and how they all came together to create a dominating machine in 1988 and beyond. It was not all roses, though. At Lime Rock Park, Connecticut in 1988, John Morton was testing a second brand new chassis during a practice session when the car went airborne, cresting the hill on the back straight. The car did a backflip, landed upside down, and barrel rolled in a ball of flames. Luckily, the car landed right side up, and John survived with no serious injuries, although he was dazed, bruised, cut, and burned. He raced again just over a month later with Brabham, winning the Watkins Glen GTP race. I described the lessons learned and the changes made to the car construction after this accident. The book also describes a study Yoshi Suzuka performed in the wind tunnel just prior to Morton's wreck. The FIA had asked Don if Electromotive could evaluate the stability difference between a flat-bottom car and a diffuser-equipped car over a hump in the road. Which is safer? It was highly coincidental that this type of accident had occurred to Electromotive only weeks after his study was performed. The results of that test are shown in the book. Later in 1988 in Columbus, Ohio, Jeff Brabham secured the first of his 4 straight IMSA Camel GT Drivers' Championships. I give the storylines of each race the car entered from 1985 to 1989, all the highs and lows that come with auto racing, and the rivalries that emerge, especially between the Tom Walkinshaw Jaguars and the Nissan team. 1988 was also the year Electromotive made the jump from hand drawings to a 2-dimensional CAD system called Anvil 1000MD. The rear chassis crossbeam was the first drawing I made, shown in the upper right. Around the drawing are hand calculations I did for the section modules of the beam at several points to check the stress due to shock loading. This is the kind of detailed engineering approach we use to design parts at Electromotive. These and other drawings are displayed in the book. In early 1989, Electromotive made its first attempt at the 24 Hours of Daytona and the 12 Hours of Sebring. We'd worked hard on the reliability and hoped for the best. We led the 24-hour race into the 19th hour until a drop valve ended the race for us. However, at the 12 Hours of Sebring, the car showed its speed and reliability, taking the win by a 2-lap margin. The winning ways continued throughout the 1989 season with Jeff Brabham and Chip Robinson. Jeff overcame Chip's points lead in the last race to win his second Drivers' Championship, and Nissan won its first IMSA GTP Manufacturers' Championship. During the season, work began on a new 90 GTP car, later named the MPT 90. I described the philosophy and the design of the new car during the 1989 season, along with the race storylines, with the Nissans battling the TWR Jaguars, the Porsche 962s, and other manufacturers. It was a great time in my life, one that helped propel me as a race car designer and race engineer for the next 26 plus years of my career to the present time. Using my notes and the help from my colleagues, I compiled as complete and as accurate as possible the technical accomplishments of this great group of people. The 9-inch by 12-inch 444-page book has over 600 images, including professional photography, in-shop photos taken by me and my colleagues, and images of drawings and data. It was an incredible time in motor racing history, and I hope this book preserves some of those memories. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to handle Q&A after we go through Jonathan's presentation, but we've already got a few of them coming in. I had a couple prior come in via email, and we're getting some posted now. So anyone who'd like to post a question, please do so, and then we'll handle that. I think Q&A will go as long as we can keep our 2 speakers here. So Jonathan, let's switch over. We're going to talk safety. So share your screen and let's talk HANS. Jonathan, are you unmuted? And Chris, you can kill your video for right now.
Okay.
I'm
Jonathan, you want to go up? Or yeah, Jonathan, you want to go up to slideshow and start?
Here we go. Have you got me now?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. So let me get started on the slideshow. And what I did was I added a slide. Since you guys can't see me, there I am. So it might be just as good that you can't see me. That way Chris can't see that poster of the Porsche 962s behind me. But I want to thank Dean and TJ and John for hosting this webinar. And I really welcome the opportunity to talk with engineers interested in racing and to share the podium with Chris. So my show and tell items are not very useful at this point, but as the subtitle of the book indicates, How the HANS Help Save Racing, Crash covers a significant piece of racing history. And the story cannot be told without understanding the engineering behind the HANS device and without establishing in quantifiable terms why a safety crisis emerged in the major professional series in the 1990s and early 2000s. So in many ways, it is an engineering book, but above all, it's a crackerjack story. And I think you'll see what I'm saying as the PowerPoint unfolds. So the death of Patrick Jackmart from a basal skull fracture in 1981 is a pretty well-known story, and because it galvanized Jim Downing and his brother-in-law, Bob Hubbard, a biomechanical engineer, to take action on head injuries. But the lesser-known fact is that in the previous year, Jim destroyed a racing beat Mazda, which is shown here, what's left of it, at Mosport. I'm sure many of you out there are familiar with the Racing Beat team. And this incident gave him a concussion and really started him to think about head injuries a little more than a year before the Jackmart crash. On the technical side of this piece here is that a head-on crash could have been far more injurious for Downing, maybe deadly. Manfred Winkelhock died in a head-on crash at this corner 5 years later on board a Porsche 962. So this is Jim wearing a Model 1 HANS at Road Atlanta in 1989. He was pretty much a solitary man in pro racing when it came to head restraints for more than a decade. But the lesser known fact is that Jim kept the HANS Performance Products Company afloat during the first 10 years of the company by selling around 280 of the Elvis collar devices that you see here, the Model 1, for $2,500 each, mostly to older club drivers who were in open cockpit cars like Formula V or Formula Ford or Formula Continental, and to powerboat racers. The technical thing here is that the Model 1 had 3 tethers, which is why you had the big collar, one in the back plus one on either side. In addition to providing protection and side impact, the side tethers could be tightened for neck support in longer high-speed races. And in some ways, this helped Jim sell the product. So HANS inventor Bob Hubbard here on the left had lots of support from safety guru John Melvin throughout this process. And the lesser known aspect is that, racing safety companies showed no interest in selling the HANS. So Bob Hubbard concluded that he and Jim Downing had a moral duty to save lives because he knew it would work, which led to the launch of the HANS Performance Products in 1990. The technical angle here is that the long-term success of the HANS resulted from Hubbard's commitment to proving scientifically the device worked through sled testing. And over the years, there were a lot of those. So several years after cobbling together his cardboard and duct tape prototypes on his kitchen table in East Lansing, Bob came up with conducted his first successful sled test in 1989 with the HANS. This photo here is obviously not the first one. First of all, it's a modern HANS. The lighting is perfect and all that. But it does demonstrate how the HANS worked and how visually you can see it in the sled test. Lesser known aspect of this sled testing, it confirmed the energy transfer for the HANS to the torso would not create a serious spinal or chest injury through compression. So the technical aspect here is that accelerometers at the base of the Hybrid 3 dummy's head recorded data for the X, Y, and Z axis during the sled test, and that's how they were able to determine what was going on and compare with, without a HANS and with the HANS to determine that the HANS actually worked. So 1994, fatal crashes of Roland Ratzenberger and Senna in the same Grand Prix weekend at Imola in 1994 led to a safety revolution in Formula One. It was Ratzenberger who suffered the basal skull fracture. Senna, of course, was killed by the errant suspension part that went through his helmet visor and through his skull. So the lesser known fact here is that after that F1 safety revolution began, Mika Häkkinen's crash in Australia in 1995 in the Grand Prix prompted Mercedes to start investigating cockpit airbags before deciding to develop a smaller HANS. Häkkinen suffered a basal skull fracture after all the changes they'd made in the previous year to the cars, and everybody realized there was a missing piece to the F1 safety program. So the technical angle here is that after an agreement was made, Mercedes ran hundreds of sled tests in Stuttgart, 1997 and 1998, to evaluate and then help Hubbard create a downsized Model 2. That's really how the downsized model came about. So a year after the fatal crashes of but F1 was not the first to use the HANS device. After fatal crashes to Gonzalo Rodriguez, Greg Moore, Christian Fittipaldi won the 2000 kart season finale at Fontana. Some of y'all may remember this race because the qualifying speed was 240 miles per hour, which the record still stands. And this was the first race where the downsized Model 2 was mandated by a major series. CART required it for the last race in preparation for mandating it on ovals in 2001. Lesser known fact here is that actor Paul Newman of Newman Haas Racing paid for the in-car testing at Sebring to help develop the smaller Model 2 HANS, because fit with the drivers in the cockpit was crucial, not necessarily the numbers on a sled test dummy. So that they spent a lot of time, a lot of miles with Christian Fittipaldi, as it turned out, to develop a shape that worked. And out of that came a universal shape. So the technical, which, the HANS had to have that in order for drivers to accept it. So the technical angle here is that two tethers at the rear of the device with the downsized HANS made it a frontal head restraint. The numbers were better because of the location of the two tethers in the back, but in terms of providing better safety. But head surrounds or high cockpit sides were needed for protection and side impacts. The HANS worked fine and offset impacts up to 45 degrees. So Earnhardt's crash we're all familiar with. In the last lap of 2001, the Daytona 500, not long after Fittipaldi won that race in Fontana, led to more sales of the HANS device in a single week than had been sold by HANS Performance products in the previous 10 years. Literally, the phone rang off the hook on Monday at HANS Performance products. Lesser known fact, this is real key, in the 10 years after Earnhardt's death, more American race car drivers died behind the wheel than in the 10 years prior to Earnhardt's death. The majority of them on short tracks and in drag racing. And this is the kind of thing that I think I hear a lot of from people that talk about the book and come back and talk to me. They learn a lot of things they didn't know otherwise. Everybody thought the safety immediately spread everywhere. Well, the technology spread to the short track racing, that is better chassis, better suspension, crate motors, and all that sort of thing. But the safety technology did not change over to the short tracks and weekend warriors. The technology exchange just wasn't there. So they were going faster, and more of them died, many of them from basal skull fractures. So the technical here is that the cornering speeds in NASCAR were decisive in the fatal skull fractures, not the stiffness of the chassis. There was a lot of talk and chatter about the stiffness of the chassis. Technical mathematical models were created that demonstrated that no matter how much you reduce the rigidity of the chassis, the speed is what determined the injury threshold. So Earnhardt's crash was watched by 17 million people on Fox Sports. NASCAR, because of the pressure, public pressure, produced a 2-volume book as part of its investigation. Data generated by NASCAR's experts confirmed that excessive neck tension killed Earnhardt and that a HANS likely would have saved him. I reviewed that NASCAR investigation. Barry Myers of Duke University came to a different conclusion. He said it was head whip. NASCAR folks said it was Earnhardt's head hitting the steering wheel. In either case, the excessive neck tension due to his belts being done wrong and the massive impact is what killed him. So it's a NASCAR privately acknowledged that the HANS probably likely would have saved him. Here's Fernando Alonso. He's wearing a device built by Renault with a progressive rear angle there. That's unusual. He became the first driver saved in Formula One from a serious or fatal injury by a HANS, saved by a HANS during the 2003 Brazilian Grand Prix. The lesser known fact here is that drivers and teams in F1, just like Dale Earnhardt in NASCAR, for 2 seasons following the announcement of the FIA's mandate, refused to wear one. So, Dale Earnhardt was not alone. Dario Franchitti, another story in the book about his lopsided shoulders, being another. There were a lot of drivers who refused to wear the HANS. Jacques Villeneuve was very vocal. And the problem was that the drivers in F1 couldn't get it to fit. Here, the technical angle was some F1 teams like Renault figured it out when they built this very interesting progressive angle to the back of the HANS. But other teams only achieved the proper fit for their drivers after obtaining HANS devices that had been used in CART. So CART's decision after the death of Greg Moore and Gonzalo Rodriguez, Gonzalo from a basal skull fracture, Greg Moore just had an airplane crash effectively. That really, really made a huge difference in Newman's investment in getting the fit right and Fittipaldi willing to do the work. Sebastian Bourdais may not have walked away from this crash, but he was conscious enough to tell workers he'd broken his pelvis. He hit the wall 227 miles an hour in Indy qualifying. Here's a very important but lesser known fact. The safer barrier is not sufficient to prevent basal skull fractures. In high energy crashes, high speed, the safer barrier helps make sure cockpit safety equipment such as the seat and harness remain intact. And that's a very important function that really made a difference in helping preventing Bourdais from sustaining more serious injuries. But he needed the HANS device because a peak in G-force always occurs in crashes of great energy. Even with a safer barrier, that peak load can exceed the limit for neck tension and shear without a HANS device. So that's just a survey of some of the things that are in the book.
Okay, Chris, you want to turn your video back on? And I guess we won't have Jonathan, other than if you can put a static picture of himself up there, but we won't worry about that. We're going to go to some Q&A. I'm going to kind of bounce this back and forth between both of you. We've got some questions coming in. We'll start off the first one for Chris. Talk about a little bit the tech support you guys got. Was it all in-house, everything? Did you get tech support from Nissan USA, Japan, local aerospace companies?
Yeah, I mean, Nissan in Japan, when we started doing the aluminum block drawings, they sent us over the complete iron block drawings, the stock production iron block drawings. And it's kind of funny because the guy, Joe Hanahori, I worked with, he's a aluminum block designer in Southern California that did a lot of big block Chevys and sprint car motors, drag racing motors. He always used to call the drawings we got, because it was all in Japanese, it was all metric in Japanese, and he always used to call them hieroglyphics because we didn't know anything of what they said. We just knew what the numbers were. So it's kind of funny, but other than that, I mean, most of the technology came from within. Don and Wes and Trevor, they all had so much experience that what they wanted to do was what we did, and it all worked. So not a whole lot that I can remember from Nissan. Actually,
following on that, you worked with two amazing engineers, characters as well. You got any good Trevor Harris or Don Devendorf stories? Yeah, I do. Trevor was, he's what an amazing guy he is. One thing I'll say about Trevor is no matter how dire the situation was, when he would come into the shop, he always had a smile on his face.
And I always thought that was great. You know, we could have just gotten our ass kicked the last weekend by Jaguars or something, and he would come in with a smile on his face and ready to work to see what we can do to make it better. So that was always real inspirational from him. But one thing, when we started working at MPTI, when I was working at Electromotive, Trevor was like a contract worker, so he didn't come into the shop very much. But when MPTI got formed afterwards, he was required to come to the shop 3 days a week. And so he would be in his office, and me and a couple other engineers, Andy Borm and Rob Edwards, would go knock on his door at like 10 o'clock in the morning. And we would hear behind the door, "Go away, I got work to do." And we'd say, "Hey, Trevor, we want to talk about suspension." "Okay, come right on in." And we'd open the door, go in, all three of us would sit there and talk for hours with him, all the way to lunchtime, and just talking about suspension and his theories on, shocks, what shocks do, how you spring a car and all this kind of stuff. And just great source of knowledge that all three of us got from him. And I think all three of us have used it very well in our future. But it was always just funny that he would try to kick us away, and then we would, end up talking for days, or it seemed like days with him about everything. But one time we go to lunch, and he's got Trevor, he's diabetic, so he's got an insulin pump in his shirt pocket, and he's driving us all to lunch, and we're talking. All of a sudden, this thing starts beeping, and we turn to him, "Trevor, you okay? Do we need to, do I need to drive? Are you okay?" And he starts kind of freaking out, and like he's having a spasm or something, and he just kind of was joking with us about it, and he's, "I'm all right, we're good. I just punched this in good." So anyway, always good fun to talk with Trevor.
Yeah,
And I have another story too about Don Devendorf, which is pretty funny. He was on the pit cart one time, and the EECP, they had telemetry back in the 80s, and they could see if the EECP was working properly or not. One time, Brabham came in for a pit stop, and I think it was during practice session or something, but he left the pit, and the engine was only working on one bank. And so Don jumps off the pit stand and runs down pit lane, waving his arms, trying to get Jeff's attention to tell him to shut the car off and restart. So when he gets back to the pit cart, the guys on the pit cart go, "Don, you got a radio, use your radio." And so the next race, they installed a 5-point harness on the pit cart and had Don sit in it and put the harness on so he wouldn't leave the pit cart. So Don took it. He was great. He took it all in stride. It was really funny.
We got a technical question here. What CPU was used for the EECP? How much memory was in it?
Yeah, that's a tough question for me, but I believe in the beginning, Don built an EECP based on function generators. Was the first one he built. This it was all analog. There was no circuit boards or anything in it. And it was a matter of changing resistors and capacitors to change the functions of the motor. And when Nissan contracted them to build digital EECPs that they could reproduce, because there was only one of those other ones, because it was so difficult. It was difficult to make and difficult to manage. You couldn't even it was very difficult to tune it. So the digital one was more of your more normal type of electronics, where it had circuit boards, and there was an EEPROM that held the program. So when you plug the EEPROM in, what you do is burn the EEPROM on an EEPROM burner from your data from the dyno, and then so that map would be on that EEPROM. You'd plug it into the EECP, and that would run the engine. So it wasn't collecting data at that point. It was just an engine control processor. So the processor they were using was an Intel A8097-90. So I don't know if anybody remembers that, but as a member of the Intel MCS-96 microcontroller family. And so there wasn't really much memory. And then we made data loggers, and that's the question I would have to go back and ask the guys that were working on that exactly how much memory those data loggers had. But they did have a big this huge box that was a macro logger, and it could get all sorts of data, but it was about this big, and too big to put on the car for race. They only use it for testing. And then they came up with what they called a micro logger, which was a little bit smaller box that could gather data. So I'm sorry, I can't really tell you how much memory it had. I'm sure it wasn't that much, being in the 80s, but it was enough to get the data we needed to move forward.
We'll switch gears over to Jonathan. A couple of questions for you. First off, what brought you to the book? I know you're Atlanta-based. Jim Downey's Atlanta-based. Did he come to you and say, "Hey, I want the story told," or were you just thought, "Hey, this is something that people need to know more about"?
Yeah, that's a good question. But first, I want to say that I was fortunate to work with Don Devendorf and Trevor Harris and the Electromotive team as a journalist for On Track Magazine and Autosport, and they were an interesting group of guys, above and beyond the drivers, who are also some interesting folks to work with. So also I helped Chris edit the book, so it is a great book. I highly recommend it. What got me started on Crash was Jim Downing. More or less the market for freelance writing crashed as a result of the internet and some other things, and race report writing wasn't available for me. So I went to work for Jim Downing. He called and asked me to help him work at HANS. So I worked there for a year or so before I overheard a conversation about how the HANS actually worked. And just to backtrack, because I was in Atlanta and reported on Jim from the time he joined the prototype ranks in 1984, I knew him, and then I had friends that were injured. One didn't survive, Butch Lindley, a short track driver, great short track driver, two-time NASCAR champion, and one, Gene Felton, still a friend, who broke his neck in a crash at Riverside, some of the folks may remember, and in the mid-1980s. So I was tuned to the idea that racing had too many head injuries. And then Jim came out with the HANS, so I got interested in the story, and I met Dr. Hubbard. And it was pretty clear to me that they had come up with a good idea. And so I started following it. In 1992, I was the first writer to file a story in a major publication, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, on the HANS device. So that was 9 years before the Earnhardt crash. But there, if you fast forward to 2010, 11, I'm working at HANS, and Gary Milgram, the director there, day-to-day operations, talked about how the HANS worked, that the helmet would be caught by the straps, pulled down over the forehead, and that the energy would be transferred in a crash through the straps to the device, then into the torso. So that was, a light went off. I said, I've been writing and reporting about this thing all this time. I thought it just restrained the head. No, it transferred the energy, and that's the key element. And I thought, well, if I didn't know that, maybe there's a story there about how it works, but also by that time, I knew how the development had gone and what a crazy quilt pattern it was before people in motor racing accepted the fact that they were missing an element in protecting drivers when it came to basal skull fractures. So, I just thought it was a very, very important piece of history, and that the story had to be told.
That's great. What do you think was the steeper learning curve? The medical aspects of the human body, or the engineering?
Well, there again, a very good question. Bob Hubbard designed the head when the Hybrid 3 anthropomorphic device came out. Crash test dummies were developed in the 1960s because Congress mandated that the car industry had to do a better job with safety. So Bob was working for the GM research at the time that they decided to create the test dummy. Bob designed the head for the Hybrid 3 test dummy. And this dummy was used for crash testing by the automotive industry for over 3 decades. But Bob, by virtue of designing it, and his PhD was in skull bone properties, So he designed it. He understood he already understood, as you mentioned, the medical question about how the body worked, where the center of gravity was in the head. And he translated how much a head weighs, how much it's able to resist outside pressure. So he translated that into the crash test dummy head for the Hybrid 3, which was built by a group in Michigan. But again, so he had already knew the medical side, and he also already knew the history of crash testing with those dummies. So that was a huge head start. And so that's a very good question. And then the learning curve became, how do I create a device? I know if the basal skull fracture is killing fractured jack mark, how do I create a device that killed him and killed others? How do I create a device that will keep the top of the neck and the bottom of the neck in relative proportion or to one another, so that you don't get the head whip? So that's where he started, and he noodled it through basically. And then he realized you had to have a tether with a high collar, that because the tethers had to run straight from the center of gravity to a high collar. Again, key to why the HANS works so well. So then he had to noodle through how to build a device that somebody could wear in a car that would accomplish that goal of having the tethers run to a high collar, transfer the energy to the torso. So he noodled that through, and that comprises those two things: noodling what to do and then how to do it are two chapters in the book, actually.
Okay. Back to Chris. Chris, a question for you. Since the team was relatively large, you were doing chassis and engine, so you weren't involved in everything. So what were any of the surprises you learned? Because you had to reach out to some of your former teammates. What was the biggest surprise that you learned about the car that you didn't even know as a team member?
Yeah, well, there's some funny stuff early on, because I got there in 1986 and they were running these B210s and other 280ZXs and stuff in IMSA early on in the 70s, and these cars were mostly stock. One thing I learned was when one year, I think it was 1974, Don was driving the B210 going for the national championship at Road Atlanta. And on Sunday morning, he goes off first or second lap on cold tires, runs the car in the wall, tears up the right front ball joint, the right front upright on the car. And they didn't have a spare. And all the Nissan dealers were closed. It was Sunday morning, so they had no way of getting one. So they did this more than once. They went out in the parking lot and found a car. It was a 1200 sedan Nissan. And they found another car just like it. Took the floor jack, went over there with tools, took the part off the car, put a note on the car saying, "Hey, we borrowed your part. We're going to return it after the race." And took it down, put it on the car, and Don goes out and wins the race with it. So that was pretty funny. They did other things too, stealing transmissions out of people and stuff, but it's never a problem. Everybody was always happy when they used their parts on their race car. So it's pretty funny. But one thing I learned too was when the EECP, it started evolving more and more, and I wasn't involved in that at all. I just knew that it was remarkable what they were doing, controlling this engine with electronics back then was crazy. And they just kept progressing and progressing. They started looking at stuff like using lipstick camera on the back of the car, and they were working on a liquid crystal display so they could display the rear view mirror, get rid of the mirrors off the car, help drag on the car, and also tie that LCD into the EECP so they could display all the data to Jeff, just like they're doing these days. It was almost the same kind of thing you're seeing like with the Motec system these days. That's what they were working on in the 90s. So it was incredible what kind of advances they were making with the electronics. So that was big.
Actually, a follow-up a little bit related to that, where was GTP relative to other series in terms of technology, compared obviously to Group C in Europe, but then even making some comparisons were you more or less advanced than Formula One or IndyCar and other series at the time?
Yeah, I mean, at that time, obviously, Formula One is always the top pinnacle. They've got the budgets, they've got the some of the smartest people in racing working in Formula One, and they're over the years, over the history of Formula One, they've always been top. And it has a lot to do with the rules. Their rules aren't, well, back then anyway, they weren't very tied down to much. Our rules weren't either, but we were making downforce, and I think we were probably making more downforce than the Indy cars, and probably with Formula One because we had more surface area near the ground that we could use to suck the car down with. Formula One, you have the wings that are close to the ground, but they don't cover a whole lot of area. With the huge diffusers we were running, I mean, these things were massive. They were getting such high-speed air into the car that these cars were just sucking to the ground. It was unbelievable. Indy cars, same. They were back then. It wasn't a spec Indy car like it is now. They were all building their own Indy cars, and those things were, they were as, similar to what we were doing. They just had a lighter car, different engine rules, different weights. So they were, if you go around American tracks, Indy car would usually be a second or two quicker than us. But we were right there as far as the technology with them. And Group C was the same. There was cars that ran in Group C and in GTP the same, but Group C had a different set of rules. They were running with a certain allocation of fuel. They had no air restrictors on the engines, or they could make as much horsepower as they wanted. And in the beginning of IMSA, you could do that too, but IMSA started putting restrictors on the cars to limit the horsepower on these turbo cars because the normally aspirated cars couldn't keep up. So they wanted to level the playing field with all that. So, the Group C cars were, pretty similar to the GTP cars, just different rules. So,
you followed
actually in Tampa in 1988, they had a World Challenge where they brought Group C cars and the GTP cars together. And the only bad thing about it was the TWR Jaguars didn't show up, nor the Mercedes. But Electromotive managed to put it on pole and win that race. So that was kind of cool, beating up on some Porsche 962s that were coming over from Europe. So,
well, getting back to, that was a kind of a golden era of GTP racing and pretty deep fields. How would it compare from an engineering standpoint, your perspective of the GTP era versus the DPI era now in terms of engineering challenges?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a bit different now. I mean, it is pretty much the same series that has progressed and called different things over the years, but it's pretty much exactly what DPI is what GTP was back then. But the major difference is there were hardly any rules. I mean, there was a rule book in GTP racing, and you had a certain engine maximum displacement you could run, but the boost in the beginning was unlimited. You could run whatever you thought you could make. DPI, they're limited on maximum allowable boost per, on an RPM chart. They limit their RPM. They limit where their lambda can move around so that nobody tries to cheat. So they have a lot more BOP, balance and performance, where back in '87 there was no BOP. It was run as much power as you wanted. In 1988, they came up with restrictors, and that was really the first BOP that IMSA came up with. But I mean, there's things like we were running iron brakes. These cars now, they're all on carbon brakes, which are just unbelievable stopping power. The tires back then, we were in a tire war. Anybody could build a tire for GTP racing and go do it. Now you're on a spec tire in DPI. So there's a lot of differences. Speeds are pretty similar there. And a big thing, DPI cars are making about 600 horsepower, where we're making, around 1,000 back then. So the technology of the chassis, we were running aluminum honeycomb chassis, and now they're all full composite chassis, really stiff composite chassis. And we were trying to work with aluminum to try to keep the stiffness up. And we eventually started going into carbon stuff, but back in the 80s, carbon isn't like it wasn't like it is now. You never really made brackets out of carbon. It was all just body work, so structural components were just starting to come on, and pre-preg composites was just starting to come on back then. So it's big difference in the types of materials that go in these cars these days to what we were using back then.
Okay. Switch it back over to Jonathan. Going back to the Earnhardt accident, you know, there was a lot of finger pointing, it seemed like, and what I personally recall was, I think NASCAR making a comment that they really didn't need, I think the big three offered their support from a safety standpoint, Ford, GM, and Chrysler. And I remember NASCAR kind of thumbing their nose at it and said, our mechanics don't need any input from those college boys up in Detroit. I think there was a relative quote. And they also seem to throw Bill Simpson a little bit under the bus. Anything you learned on that you can shed a light on, or?
Yeah, I mean, it was, there are a lot of details there that you're touching on. And again, they're certainly that whole path is followed through the book, but NASCAR really had a legal problem. They didn't want to commit to sanctioning anything that if it didn't work, they'd be taken to court on. That was historically the problem for NASCAR. So they're always up against that liability issue. So as they saw it. And at one point when NASCAR was taken to task for not doing what CART was doing and not having, you know, the HANS device, Bill France Jr. replied to journalist Ed Hinton, they have their legal advisors and we have ours. So there was that. And then there was the problem of the people in NASCAR didn't pay attention to anything that happened outside the garage fence. You know, so if it's not invented here, which of course you could also say Detroit is often guilty of.
Yeah.
But, you know, nothing, you know, if it wasn't invented inside that fence, then people just weren't interested. And so there was always that culture. And that all radically changed. Both those situations changed with Earnhardt's death, primarily because NASCAR underestimated the response. They thought it would go away. It just would not go away. It remained a big story until they did their media conference in August. So that's, you know, 6 months later. So they finally realized that they had to do this, meet it head on. And they found out from when they hired experts that where the problems were, seats, the harnesses weren't being used properly, and the cornering speeds were high enough that they really needed to have a head restraint. So they did a complete 180, and to their credit, and stepped up and spent the time to make sure all the seats and harnesses were right. During their investigation, they started on that, and they were ready by the time they got to Talladega in October to start using the HANS device. Once again, there was a liability problem. What if it didn't work? So they made sure the seats and the harness systems were working properly, and then they mandated the HANS, and also they had to have head surrounds. So they figured out how to make it work, and they committed themselves, and that was a 180-degree turn. The Bill Simpson scenario, that's just NASCAR being NASCAR, and Bill Simpson being Simpson, being Bill, I should say. You know, Bill, people and race fans being race fans, some of which who accused Bill of killing Earnhardt. Yeah. The bottom line was that Bill couldn't persuade his friend Dale to use the belts properly. And, you know, I don't know that he was ever going to win that. They called him Ironhead for a reason, Earnhardt. So I think that, you know, Dale had his lap belt 8 inches too far back. He had the crotch belt that came over the front of the seat instead of through the hole in the seat close to the crotch. And he had the harness down over the back of the seat, which gave it more length and therefore more opportunity to stretch. So, you know, those were.
You also still had an open face helmet, correct?
Well, yes, an open face helmet. Head whip won't save you there, and a HANS will work with an open face helmet. So if it was head whip, that wouldn't have made any difference. If it was head hitting the steering wheel, possibly the full face would have made a difference. So but Bill Simpson, being Bill, got very vocal about it also, as if he was thrown under the bus by NASCAR because NASCAR wouldn't absolve him. Well, NASCAR did, a very extensive investigation before it could say anything in public. And so it's one of them deals. And I think in the end, Bill was exonerated.
Yeah.
How would you rank the HANS device with other safety innovations? I mean, we got the two that come to mind for me is the full face helmet, and then obviously the fire suit. Any thoughts of, since you did research into other safety features and things, where does the HANS device really fit in there? I mean, is there anything else besides those three? What have saved more that are, driver centric, obviously not taking into account crash management within the car or safer barriers, or maybe the safer barrier deserves the.
That's a really good question that I had not quite thought of in that perspective, because the theme of the book is that the HANS made the difference after all the other safety improvements, because there was a missing link there. They still couldn't solve the basal skull fracture. So, but I think I like your question, because now it makes me think that the data recorders were the most important thing next, other than and possibly more important than the HANS, because the data recorders, starting after Nelson Piquet had his crash at Indy, went head on to the wall, everybody said, oh, these cars are folding up and we got to do something. And they started making stiffer cars, which is a good start, and in IndyCar racing kart. But the data recorders, and John Melvin were at GM Motorsports Safety Technology Research Program, started working with Steve Olvey and Terry Trammell and the crews in IndyCar, let's call it the kart essentially, with the data recorders. And what they would do is they would arrive on the scene of a crash, that the safety crews, Olvey or Trammell, so they'd have anecdotal information from the crash, but they also had the data recorders. And then John Melvin would set up sled tests to recreate the accidents. And therefore they could start to quantify on an engineering level, on a scientific level, what was happening in these crashes, so that they built a database. And that also, for example, it confirmed that your chest compression was not an issue with tight harness or the HANS device. It was amazing how much chest compression a driver could withstand and still walk away. So that helped them build a database, and then prove, for one thing, that the HANS could actually keep a driver below the threshold of injury once they had that database. So, that's one. But all the improvements, the stiffness of chassis, including the car of tomorrow in NASCAR, which is still there underneath whatever they're running. Formula One went to, practically doubled its the rigidity of its chassis in 2000, and IndyCar had already been down that road. So, there's this safer barrier is another one. If your safer barrier doesn't make sure that the seat and harness do their job, then the HANS can't do its job.
Yeah.
So, I'm not sure you could put a value on one above the other at this stage, because they all work in concert. The new seats, the carbon fiber seats in NASCAR. So, it's always a system.
Yeah. Okay. Chris, you were in the era where there was no gentleman racers in GTP. They were all hired gunslingers from the factory teams. How about a few thoughts on some of the drivers you worked with? Who was the best for technical feedback? Who was the guy you would put into the race the last 45 minutes when you're 30 seconds down? Who was the most fun to go have dinner with? I mean, you had Jeff Brabham, Chip Robinson, John Morton, Derek Daly, and not sure who all else, but
Yeah, a lot of them. Jeff Brabham somehow he clicked with his car, and nobody could touch him with lap times. I mean, I think Arie Luyendyk was one of the closest I saw. The few races that I was at that somebody was really close to him. And Chip was at times could out-qualify Jeff, but overall, Jeff was just, he was one with the car. I mean, and his relationship with Trevor and their communication was just unbelievable. Every race, no matter how they started out the weekend, they could nail that car by the end of the weekend, and they would have it perfectly set up. So Jeff Brabham would be, especially with that Nissan car, anybody in the world, he would be the guy you would want in it if you were 20 seconds down. As far as a fun guy, John Morton, he was an awesome guy. He was just a regular guy. You never would have thought he was a fast race car driver, but he's just such a down-to-earth, great guy to be around, and just so humble, you know. And I mean, one time they named the car Elvis after John, and the way that story started was it happened after he had crashed, but actually before he crashed, we had a band at Electromotive. There was two guys that came over from Texas that came out to California to make it in rock and roll. One was a drummer and one was a guitar player. And Mike Ferrari was a drummer, Chad Eldridge was a guitar player, and they wanted to put a band together and with some guys in the team, and they found out I play a little bit of guitar, and this other guy, Eddie San Roman, was a bass player and a bass player and a singer. And so we got together and we started playing some songs, and the Christmas party was coming up that year, at the end of 1987. And so they asked us if we would play at the party, and we're just like, yeah, sure, we'll play. And so one day we're practicing in the shop after work, and John Morton comes walking in. And we say, hey, John, what's up? And he goes, hey, I want to sing a song. Will you guys want to do that with me? And we're like, hell yeah, we'll do that. And he said, I want to sing Jailhouse Rock. So so it was awesome. We learned it, and he sang it and everything, and it was pretty fun. And we went and did the Christmas party, and he wanted nobody to know about it. So we didn't tell anybody. And in the middle of the party, he gets up with a black leather jacket turned up, and he had the words written on his hand so he wouldn't forget the words. And he got up there, and we jammed the song, and everybody was just blown away that he was up there singing. And actually, there's a video of it, and I'm gonna have to post it on YouTube. So
that would be great. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know what John Morton looks like, he actually should be Buddy Holly.
Yeah, right.
But and for those of you who watch Ford v Ferrari, where you learn about Ken Miles, John Morton started out as a teammate to Ken Miles, and John was racing this last weekend up at Monterey. So the man is ageless. So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But
he's a great guy. One
last question for you here, Chris. And I know for those of you who weren't looking at the Q&A, every time Jonathan's talking, Chris has been typing responses, and we'll have to figure out how we can get those posted onto the SAE SoCal Facebook page and or over onto YouTube, where this video will be archived. But did you do some work with off-roading? You know?
Yeah, we did. Before I get into that, I just want to say thanks to Jonathan Ingram. He helped me edit this book. Me being an engineer, I'm not a writer. I wrote a bunch of stuff, and Jonathan helped me make it to where it reads awesome. So I just want to give John a shout out for that. Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate that. But yeah, we did do off-road racing, and the thing about it was nobody at Electromotive knew anything about off-road racing when we started. What happened was, when the GTP program came to Electromotive in 1984, that year was spent designing and building the GTP car. There was no racing in IMSA, in the GTO car, any of that. It was all just trying to concentrate on getting this GTP car going, and the budget wasn't really there. So Dick Roberts, who was running the Datsun Nissan Motorsports back then, he awarded Electromotive this off-road stadium truck series for the Mickey Thompson series. And the reason he did it was to help fund Electromotive so we could keep going and not run out of money and dissolve before we could even get a GTP car done. So we did the Mickey Thompson series with Roger Mears and Sherman Balch, and it was quite an experience. We actually ended up winning the championship in 1985 with Roger Mears, and that's only the second year into it. But the Wes Moss was really involved in it, and we hired a guy named John House who worked for Mickey Thompson way back in the day, and John did an excellent job building the trucks and running them at the Mickey Thompson events. And it was always a blast to go to those things. They were getting 60,000 people in these at the LA Coliseum, at the Indiana Hoosier Dome, at the King Dome in Seattle, all over the country. They were getting massive amounts of people to watch these indoor off-road races, going over jumps. And Toyota, Ford, Chevy, Nissan, all of us were all involved in it. And then the prize money was really good. And the guys racing, I mean, it was like Ivan Stewart, Rod Millen, some pretty heavy hitters in the off-road industry were in that. So it was quite an experience, and it was a good time. And towards the end of, I think it was 1986 or 87 maybe, Nissan decided not to have Electromotive run anymore because it was kind of affecting the GTP program a little bit. So it kind of went away from us, and Roger Mears ended up taking it over and running it from there.
One last question for you, Chris. Can you talk a little bit more about the data that was collected? When you were running the GTP car, what could you collect?
In the beginning, they were just doing, it was RPM, throttle position. They were doing water temperature, oil pressure. They even had, I remember doing some testing later on, I think in the 90s, with some intercooler inlet and outlet pressure testing, trying to minimize turbo lag, even though Don's electronic unit was doing a really good job at minimizing the turbo lag. It was still, still trying to get it down to like a normally aspirated car. So there was all kinds of temperature readings before and after intercoolers, and the temperatures inside the intercooler for the air to see how much heat transfer was happening. So it was quite a bit. They had wheel speed, but there was no shock transducers or anything like that. So it was mainly more engine functions is what they were recording.
Okay, Jonathan, you got another new book coming up later this summer or the fall?
February of 2021.
Oh, it's been bumped off a little bit?
No, it's designed to come out at the start of the racing season.
Okay.
What we hope will be the start of the racing season next year.
What you want to mention what it is? And
sure, yeah, that's more of a human interest story. Chris has a few more tales to tell about the characters than I do, although the HANS book is about characters such as Senna and Earnhardt, and Greg Moore, Jim Downing, Bob. But I've done a book with Bill Lester called Winning in Reverse. So that was about primarily focused on, it's a motivational memoir about how a guy that from Northern California, an engineer who was approaching his 40th birthday, became a professional race car driver because that's what he wanted to do, and left behind a really good job at Hewlett Packard as a engineer, and how he rose to actually participate in the Winston Cup. So it's really about the hurdles that he faced, some of which was his age, some of which his background was not very good for going NASCAR racing as a California road racer, some of which was a black guy in NASCAR was a unusual scenario, and what it took for Bill to get across all those hurdles and actually make it to the Winston Cup, as it was known at the time. And then he became a winner in the Grand Am and almost won a championship. He co-drove with Jordan Taylor, actually, when Jordan was a teenager. So it's a motivational memoir called Winning in Reverse, about all the hurdles that Bill overcame. And I think it's an interesting story. It's of how NASCAR handled having a black driver in its midst and trying to open up the sport to drivers of different backgrounds.
Is your Bob Riley book still in print?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's they can order, people can order at the same website as the HANS book, jingrambooks.com, and The Art of Race Car Design by Bob Riley. I still have just a few of those left. They're all autographed by Bob. That's been a very popular, successful book, and you know, I still talk with Bob Riley. He's semi-retired, he says. So now he gets to he's in his mid 80s. He still works at Riley Technologies. He says, I'm semi-retired. That means I get to the office every day at 9 instead of 7:30.
Well, in that book, I say is highly recommended for any of the SAE students. That'd be a good one for your team library. And actually, I think that if we didn't get to questions, the answer to everything is buy the book. So let me share my screen here as we wrap up here. Any final comments from our two guests, Jonathan, Chris? Chris, anything that we missed that you'd like to cover?
No, I mean, I just hope everybody enjoyed the talk, and I hope you look into checking out my book. And I'll try to answer everything that you guys ask here before I sign off. So, yeah, Dean, I want to thank you, and I want to thank John and TJ as well for putting this on.
So this is, huge thank you to John and TJ, because I would not have been able to figure out some of the technologies on here, embarrassed to say, but it's good to have a team. So a few last things we'd like to point out is, one, posted the links here for the books. You can buy them directly from Chris and Jonathan. For those of you who are in Southern California, Auto Books up in Burbank, you can buy copies there. And I think, Chris, did you do a signing there, or did that?
Yeah, we did a COVID signing. Yep.
Yeah, and I know Jonathan was going to be out here for Acura Grand Prix of Long Beach weekend, but obviously no Long Beach Grand Prix this year. So, but Auto Books is a great source locally. We're going to do our next webinar next week with Mark Zakos. He's going to talk about cybersecurity. So that should be a very interesting topic. And just kind of a little bit of a plug here, to follow SAE SoCal. We've got a website. Merritt Johnson's been our webmaster. She's done an outstanding job on that. You can find us on LinkedIn. We've been doing a lot on Facebook over the last year or so. And we just, here again, thanks to John Steiner and TJ Keon, we now have a YouTube channel, which has this convoluted list of letters and numbers here. But if we get over 100 subscribers, I think then we can get it changed to SAE SoCal. So please go out and search for the SAE SoCal YouTube channel, subscribe to it. And this particular presentation will be archived there. And I wouldn't be surprised if you post questions there. Chris and Jonathan might even answer them there. So if there's anyone...
I just wanted to also say thanks to everybody involved, and I'm glad to see so many participants have stuck around. One thing on the final page, obviously it's www.jingrambooks.com and for the website. And the other thing is that I would like to point out that as a writer, a longtime journalist, I usually sat at my keyboards and I couldn't see my readers and they couldn't see me. So I think I inadvertently hit the wrong button when I signed on. So, but nevertheless, it's been a very enjoyable experience. And, writers become writers in part because they enjoy talking. So yeah. I will hang around and I think there's one question about what data was gathered with the data recorders, and I'll attempt to answer that one.
Okay. Last couple of things here. We've done this to where we want to have open meetings as much as possible. So we didn't charge a fee for this, and we didn't restrict it to SAE members only. But I would highly encourage, if you're not an SAE member, if you're interested enough to join us for this topic, join. If you'd like to get involved with SAE SoCal, you can reach us. That's the email I use for SAE work, membership@saesocal.org. We're always looking for new volunteers. we'll take, if you say you should invite so-and-so, we may or may not take your advice. But if you say we should have so-and-so and I know him and I'll help set it up, then we're more likely to take your advice. We're a volunteer group. We've got, over a dozen universities to help support. We've got, a very diverse portfolio of companies. I think everyone knows that the big 800-pound gorilla in the SAE world is Detroit section, but Southern California is the second largest, and we are a more diverse group because it's ground transportation, aerospace, a lot of oddball research and development. We're a leader in electric vehicles, autonomous, not just Silicon Valley. So a lot of really interesting things are happening within our section. So if you'd like to be a part of it, reach out to us. That was kind of my little plug. And then last, thanks to the generosity of our two speakers, we should check with TJ if they're still on. We randomly selected two names to get a book each. One, we're going to split them. So once we tell your names, you can send that note to membership@saesocal.org, and we'll figure out which one of you gets which book. But Nick Hunter and Rob Giovanoli, if I'm pronouncing it right, you are our two winners of the books. So
congratulations.
Way to go.
John Steiner, any words you'd like to throw in here? You take yourself off of mute.
Hey there. Thanks, Chris and Jonathan. It was a pleasure meeting you guys and having you here, and thanks for giving us your time. I put the link to the SAE SoCal YouTube channel in the chat, and I've noticed we've doubled subscribers. So all the attendees that have gave us your attention, thanks for being here with us. That's all I've got.
Yeah, and thank you. We love constructive input. If you've got some thoughts, we're still on our learning curve for Zoom and YouTube and everything. So we think we'll get smoother, but I think the content from both Chris and Jonathan was excellent. I highly recommend both books, or, if your grandmother doesn't know what to get you for Christmas, just send her a link to it and tell her to, buy that book for you. So without any further ado, I think we can wrap this call an evening, and we can go on to other things around the house, and hopefully tune in next week and we'll hear from Mark Zakos on cybersecurity.